Thank you. Thank you to Professor Duncan and our two respondents as well. We are running out of time, but I'm going to let Jane, of course, respond to some of the comments that were given by the respondents, and hopefully we can do so fairly swiftly. I'm being very Stalinist, so that we can also get some questions from the floor. First, yeah. Do we have another mic? Yes. We do. That's fantastic. Then I'll think that I'll collate and get some questions. So.
I think the securitization started way back in Africa. I'm talking now not about South Africa, but Africa. In the 50s, I don't know if you can remember the CIA assassinating an African leader. Now that took a new turn of fear among the potential African leaders. And they took a different stance towards the security apparatus. Some of them embodied it and others didn't. I think you got to look at the incipient CIA, apparatus getting into countries like South Africa, etc. This may be a divergent opinion, but I think it's essential. I think I could probably go on and say, if you look at the biography, the first biography of Nelson Mandela, the one critical factor which that biography shows is that Mr. Mandela was not alone in his motor vehicle. He wasn't alone. There was a diplomat sitting at the back. I won't say the nationality of that diplomat, but you can figure it out what the nationality of that diplomat was. And that's the only biography that showed that. And that's what I just want to end off with. Thank you.
We have a few more questions. Yeah, question back.
Hi, evening everyone. I might be wrong, I stand to be corrected. I might be wrong and I stand to be corrected, but I can't think of any first world country that isn't centralizing their security information. After the incident that took place on Monday with Al Jariz, many security experts say that many countries will find it difficult to find trust in sharing important information with South Africa. And after the Edward case, Mr. Gates, who I believe, if I'm not wrong, was the defense minister in the United States, said that because information is shared by many people, to prevent that leakage, they need to centralize the state information. So I guess my question is, these are difficult words, I think you say democratizing the state information, aren't we isolating ourselves from the international market into sharing valuable information with us? And secondly, aren't we opening up a gate of terrorism? Thank you.
Good evening, everyone. I would like to know from Professor Duncan, what challenges did she face when she was writing the book? And then what do journalists have to do in order to expose the Securocrats? Do they have to take the approach that Amabungane of the Mail and Guardian are taking in order to expose the Securocrats? Thank you.
Thanks, Jane, Mosheshwe and Peter. Those were excellent presentations. I think, Jane, you said that despite the cover of the book looking like, I think this is what you said, a B-grade horror movie, It's excellent, thorough, scholarly analysis of something we really need. And I agree with Mushweshwe. It's almost like you had inside intelligence about the timing, the launch of the book. But I think the one area you haven't talked about is the importance of organizations in the past, like the FXI, and today, like the Right to Know, which you are involved with as well. And if you could just talk a little about that as well. And finally, I think the point you made about the spy cables and exposing the neo-colonial relationship, I mean, it's quite incredible, and I know there's a lot of reasons for this, the laziness of the journalists, Mushweshwe, or the cuts that you know, the newsrooms have to undergo. But quite clearly, if you look at the newspapers in the past few days, I mean, with the exception of the journalists who are here and your newspaper, some of them completely missed the plot. One is not sure if they read the spy cables. If you look at the screaming headlines in the Star 2 days ago, written by Angela, about Iranian jihadi camps in the country. I mean, that was completely discredited, that story. Or the Hussein Solomon's quotes in the Times the day before that. So the point is, and I think the challenge you put out, Mushweshwe, should be really seriously considered. You know, the critical faculties of the journalism, despite the cuts, etc., and the role of the schools of communication, the Department of Journalisms, and, you know, from you and Jane, just to explore that a little more, what could be done. I mean, we see this in economic journalism, both in the public broadcaster and the private print and electronic media, just parroting the captains of industry and what some of us call bourgeois economists, as if that's the only economy around. With education, increasing education or skills leads to economic growth, which leads to economic competitiveness, which leads to creation of jobs. An absolutely discredited argument around the world, shown to be empirically really flawed. But day after day, that argument is parroted. So, you know, that kind of critical journalism, if we have more views on that. Thanks.
Thank you. I think we will have to cut it there, otherwise we won't get the input from our author. So I'm going to hand over to you, Jane, and I think you've been wired up. We can.
Yes, I have. And thank you.
Wired up.
And thank you very much for the questions. A lot of the questions I'll just take as food for thought as well, because I think, sorry, having a problem here, because some of them really need to be thought about a bit more deeply. I can't claim to have all the answers in relation to all the questions at this moment in time. Sorry, this is a problem. I'm getting an echo. There we go. I think perhaps to start with some of the easier ones, what kind of challenges did I face in putting the book together? Well, one of the obvious challenges is the highly secretive nature of what's going on inside the security cluster. It really was a frustration. I did manage to get a number of interviews. So, for instance, the one that I mentioned involving Dennis Dlomo was very revealing, actually. Although it was exceedingly difficult to get the kind of documents that I needed out of the State Security Agency. And in fact, there are a series of information requests that the South African History Archive assisted me with that are in the process of going to court at the moment. So documents like the National Intelligence Priorities, for instance, a range of documents in relation to communications surveillance, a range of documents in around the joint deployments of the police and the military, for instance, which is an indicator of growing police militarization. It's those kinds of documents that weren't provided and that hopefully will be released through court processes in the next couple of years. So certainly a lack of information. Although, as I said earlier, there's a lot of information that's out there that I think isn't being optimized. But given that my approach tended to be to try and tell the story of the securitization of South African politics from below, by relying particularly on the experiences of political activists in their increasingly conflictual interactions with the coercive capacities of the state, there was a huge amount of raw data there that I drew on. And there are some data sources actually that have hardly even been tapped on. So, for instance, the municipal records that exist in terms of the Gatherings Act provided an incredibly rich source of information about trends in protest action. And what those documents told us, for instance, I've included some of this analysis here, but I'm also busy finalizing a sequel, a follow-up to this particular book that analyzes data from 12 municipalities in different parts of the country, and it's fascinating because it tells you volumes about political shifts that are taking place at local level in different parts of the country. And while I think it's pretty clear that the increasingly authoritarian response of the state, Peter, is in response to direct challenges from below, I think that the collusion, if you like, between state and capital is far more stark in Rustenburg. I think that has proved in the past couple of years to be the heart of industrial struggles. And that collusion is absolutely apparent in the municipal records. In fact, it's a couple of activists have described the Rustenburg municipality and their conduct in systematically banning protests as being the censorship board of the mining houses in the area. So that kind of direct collusion is particularly apparent in Rustenburg. I think less so in other parts of the country, certainly in the other municipalities. There's a lot of kind of variation in the picture. Moshweshwe raised the question of to what extent does the administrative layer act as a check and balance on growing repression. And they do act as a check and balance in some parts of the country, in certain municipalities. So, for instance, I'd found in municipalities like Mbombela and the Nelson Mandela Metro, in the case of the Nelson Mandela Metro, you had a responsible officer who was deciding whether to grant or deny permission, I'm using their language, to allow protests. The Nelson Mandela Metro responsible officer was very open because he was a DA guy. So he had a vested political interest in embarrassing the municipality because, you know, in the next election, the Metro may well fall to the DA. In the case of the Nelson Mandela Metro, you had a pure bureaucrat there. And there are these people inside the security cluster, people who consider themselves to be professional spies, who consider themselves to be beyond the kind of political machinations and really genuinely want to serve the public interest and the national interest as an instance of the public interest. They are out there and they are exercising influence. So in the case of the Mbombela municipality, for instance, there's a good bureaucrat in there who himself has grievances with the dysfunctionality of the municipality and also just allows protests to take place because he himself wants the rot to be aired. So it's these kinds of fissures between the administrative layer and the political layer that needs to be recognized, because that in turn provides possibilities to develop political strategies and tactics that sharpen those particular contradictions. To what extent Okay, I certainly can't touch on, even start to touch on all the questions that have been raised. The non-ANC people inside the security cluster are quite important when it comes to the non-statutory forces that were absorbed into the military, for instance. They haven't really exerted a powerful voice inside the military. But the people who have exercised a powerful voice inside the military are the South African National Defence Union, SANDU, who I think has been incredibly vocal. Now, they are a combination of the old statutory forces and people who've joined from the non-statutory forces. So it's become a kind of mixed bag union, but it's actually proved to be highly effective in terms of checking the kind of potential abuses of the military from the inside. And I think also, given the strength of the industrial unions inside the military, I think it's also assisted, it's contributed towards developing a level of class consciousness within the military that hasn't really existed to the same extent in the police and certainly not in the intelligence services, that I think has created a problem for the leadership of the security cluster. The working class, the boots on the ground, have been starved of the basic resources that are necessary in order to have a decent life, a decent quality of life inside the military. And I think that makes them a wild card in terms of any comprehensive, repressive response. There are so many questions I can't even start. Maybe just to end on or land on one question that was raised by Moshweshwe about academic journalistic collaborations. It's certainly something that we'd like to encourage, from our end as the Department of Journalism, Film and Television. And in fact, there was such a journalistic academic collaboration towards the middle of last year, where this mapping of protests in the municipalities that I spoke about actually resulted in a data journalism project with the Mail and Guardian. And it was, I think, fascinating in the sense that it allowed us to explode a number of the academic, particularly journalistic myths about the wave of protest action. What Peter was touching on earlier, that, for example, there's an increasing number of violent service delivery protests. Well, actually, if you really mine the data, you start to realize that the overwhelming picture is a picture of peaceful protests. And in fact, disruptive and even violent protests are the exception, although they're growing. And peaceful protests are the rule. But you wouldn't believe that, actually, if one looked at the media reporting or what passes as authoritative comment on these particular issues. And I think it's this kind of misreporting that is feeding into moral panics, and it's also making the police case for greater resourcing of the police. And the budget increases that Peter referred to at the introduction to his comments are actually particularly for public order policing. In fact, they are seeking a doubling of public order policing capacity. When actually, if you really look at the levels of protest action, even if you're thinking with a Securocrats hat on, you can't even start to justify this over-policing that they are, or over-resourcing of public order policing that they're attempting to achieve. And I think this in itself is an indication of a growing securitized response to social problems. But the police themselves, I don't think we're going to see the kind of internal divisions. There are certainly internal divisions within the police, and a lot of it has got to do with whether the police are unionized and whether they're integrated into community policing forums. So it's become apparent that if you do have community policing forums, and there's a level of discussion between community activists and police within those community policing forums, and also also if the police are locally based as well, are based in communities that are dealing with particular social problems and understand those conditions from the inside, policing tends to be less violent. Whereas with the paramilitary policing units, for instance, they tend to be sent in from the outside. And this is an indicator of increasing centralization, that there's a growing tendency for policing units to be instructed to move into a particular area from the outside. And that, because one doesn't have the police knowledge of local conditions, is a major driver of growing police violence, as is a lack of effective industrialization and unionization of the police. I think if we had a truly effective police union, not the kind of sorry excuse of a police union in the form of pop crew that we have at the moment, we may have really important political divisions opening up within the police in the same way that we've seen in the military.
I think there were a few questions that came from the floor here as well, and what triggered the process, as I understood it. So end on that.
Sure. What triggered the process was, I think, a very long history of engagement with these kinds of issues, and perhaps this will give me an opportunity to respond directly to Salim's point and also another question that Peter raised. What can be done, and what kind of organization do we need in order to roll back this growing phenomenon of securitization? I think the kind of experiences that we had in attempting to organize the problem when it really started to become a problem, which was the early 2000s, with the rise of serious political contenders, independent organizations that were starting to come into being, like the Anti-Privatization Forum, for instance, the Soweto Electricity Crisis Committee, and the Landless People's Movement. That is really where this growing securitization started to happen. The kind of architecture of the surveillance state actually started to be laid down there. And it started to be laid down and rolled out and intensified by a number of ministers, including Ronnie Kestrel's. And I think that, Moshweshe, you've pointed to this, that his hands, despite him having perhaps moved over onto the other side, are not also entirely clean as well, because he really started off the kind of discourse of protests being understood increasingly as threats to national security. But there was a lot of resistance that grew to these kinds of measures that started to be rolled out in the early 2000s, although a lot of this didn't really find its way into the media. There were a lot of self-defense strategies that started to be rolled out. So for instance, there is now a layer of activists out there who can recite the Regulation of Gatherings Act backwards to the police. And that layer was built deliberately and systematically over a fairly long period of time, and it's proved to be highly effective. And that layer of activists have moved from organization to organization. So in spite of the fact that we've seen the LPM and the APF collapsing, they've now moved into organizations such as the Right to Know campaign, and are continuing that work and in fact intensifying that work. So the Right to Know campaign, one of its legs is the Right to Protest campaign, where the kind of tactical and strategic and political responses to the growing repression of protests is continuing. And it's this kind of practical self-defense work that I think is exceedingly important, and actually it works damn well. It really, really works. I think that many protests, many problems have been headed off. Many potential cases of police violence have been headed off because of this kind of knowledge that has been acquired and that has now has been wielded as a self-defense strategy. I certainly wouldn't discount the importance of physical self-defense, because if we look at the most extreme case in the country at the moment, KwaZulu-Natal, the fact that we've seen NUMSA shop stewards being killed, for instance, Abahlali members being assassinated, and the fact that these problems aren't being dealt with systematically by the security cluster. In fact, they appear to be overlooking them. Perhaps tellingly so. In those circumstances, I certainly wouldn't discount the need for physical self-defense. But I think that the fact that these political divisions do exist in the security cluster, we need to recognize them. It also calls for us to craft political responses as well to sharpen those particular contradictions. And there's so much that can be done in that space. The fact that we've managed to prize out the list of national key points, the fact that we've managed to beat back the worst aspects of the secrecy bill at the heart of Jacob Zuma's power, which is the security cluster, I think should give us hope. It should give us hope in the capacity of our own self-activity and activism to be able to stop these problems and prevent the country from lapsing into further repression.
Human Rights Day.
Human Rights Day.
All right. Sorry. Maybe I should just. And just to say, just in terms of practical actions, on March the 21st, Sharpeville Day, otherwise known as Human Rights Day, there's going to be a national day of action against police repression. And I think it's that kind of action that is extremely important for all of us to get involved in, because it gives us the space to be able to do something practical about these growing problems.
Thank you very much, Jane and panelists. It's always like this. You run out of time, and not all questions can be answered. And of course, we've discussed the media. We haven't even started dissecting where does this take us as citizens. We will all start taping our superiors and so forth. Where does the security state take us? The lives of others, so to speak. I'm sure that Jane will be available in the foyer here for a little while longer for questions and discussions for those of you who feel that you still have questions and answers. But I think we should give our author and our panelists a big round of applause.
The University of Johannesburg. Rethink, reinvent.